So this is the Sculpture Forum again, and we are going to be talking about an exhibition by Richard Serra at Zwirner Gallery. And we're talking about it via Zoom. Thank you, RACHAEL BOHLANDER, for a wonderful job of getting images of this show. And for setting up this Zoom. And I am going to be talking about it. I'm Garth Evans. I'm going to be talking about it with BRANDT, JUNCEAU, and JOCK, the usual crew. So this show consists of a single object and a lot of drawings. And I wish it was just a single object and not the drawings. I think that single object, which is a massive block of steel in the form of a cylinder about 10 feet high and probably 5 feet across, maybe, or more than 5 feet across in diameter, set in the center of this gallery, which is basically, I think, a square. And there's something very dramatic about this statement. It is also lit just by daylight through the skylights in the gallery, and it is quite a singular kind of event. And one has the feeling, I had the feeling rather, that it was almost like we were supposed to go and worship before this thing. It is astonishing and quite beautiful in many ways. At the same time, you know, I found myself really questioning it and being somewhat disturbed by the experience. BRANDT, JOCK, help.
The worshipful quality you describe is, you know, that the artists of the gallery may call it inadvertent, but it's, you know, it's classic because the piece is located dead center in the gallery, you know, a big square room on the forward and lateral axes. It's, you know, as people, you know, ancient people or not, it's a kind of an inescapable predicament, an inescapable physical illusion. And so much of Serra's work, I find, depends on what you could call magic, you know, and various elements of spectacle, illusion, allusion, metaphor, you know, that are not intrinsic to his own statements about his work, which would seem to sort of leave all that aside. So in a sense, his work has a cake and eats it too.
Yeah, that sense in which it offers itself as a simple fact, an indisputable fact, a material presence, and nothing more. At the same time, you know, what one is compelled to wonder at it and to be in awe of it. I think that's something of what you're referencing, BRANDT.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Serra has this I don't know, reputation, or you know, he's a celebrity sculptor, but I don't like to think of him that way. And I think of him as he was a friend of Louis Finkelstein, Louis being a guy who taught at this studio school, also taught at Queens College for many years, but a guy both Garth and I knew, and an ordinary guy. And that's the way I like to think of Serra. And I understand this sort of impulse to worship something, but I was surprised at I wasn't bothered by this show. We've seen in New York, you see a lot of Serra shows. This one, having just one piece in a fairly big gallery, was a relief for me. I wasn't inspired to kind of bow down before this thing. It was a relief just to see one piece, and a lot of emptiness around it. And I think of the Serra room at the Museum of Modern Art, which has the equals or a room full of 8 rectangular blocks of sculpture or steel or whatever you want to call it. But that room is just a room that really makes me uncomfortable. And I can't move. I feel I almost can't breathe in that room. Whereas I could breathe in this room. It was very bleak, but just the roundness of the cylinder allowed me to sort of walk around in a way that I can't walk around at the Museum of Modern Art. Yeah, so I understand the sort of the sense in which Serra is a kind of insane American male artist. But this was a pretty sane Serra show for me.
I think, Jock, it wouldn't be unfair to say that making the spectator some degree of discomfort on the part of the spectator has been an element of a lot of Serra's work. This did not, I agree with you, this did not create the kind of physical discomfort that somehow or other has been present in some of Serra's work, in the sense that it did not feel physically threatening. It seems very stable and solid and unmovable. This, and the amount of space around it is sufficient for one to feel that it is not encroaching on one's own space. And in that regard, it is refreshing for me in relation to my experience of some of Serra's work. At the same time, I mean, you touched on, Jack, you touched on the element that disturbs me about it. I mean, the question I found myself asking, which I articulated a little while ago when we were talking about Alan Soret's work, is what did the artist do to make this happen? What did the artist do to bring this about? What was the artist's role? What was his activity in creating this thing? And and in that sense, I kind of like wonder, really how much is this, a work, as it were, by Serra, and how much is it a work by a team of people who, pounded this thing out in some factory somewhere, to Serra's instruction for sure. But he's sitting outside of the physical production of the work, in a way that is in stark contrast to the work we were recently talking about of Alan Serra. I find myself really disturbed by the sense in which people who have these major reputations really are not actually how should I put this? Directly engaged in the physical production of the work in a way that seems to me to be intrinsic to the idea of being an artist.
Yeah, or that today, being an artist, it is sort of more complicated, and Serra is guiding the production of his work, for better or for worse, but that's what being a sculptor for many people today is. And the very few big time sculptors today actually make things with their hands, but this piece of steel is the product of Serra's will. He gathered people together and for years has developed his reputation, his connection, all of that stuff that was talked about in the interview with Christopher Wool in the Times recently. He got Christopher Wool is a guy with a big reputation, and he found himself spending most of his time developing his career, and he was really just a Sunday painter, he said in the interview, and he the pandemic allowed him to break with all the reputation work that he has to do, and allowed him to get back to painting. Well, that's the way things are now. And you've talked about this before, Garth, that lots of people have to devote an enormous amount of time and effort to the production of sculpture.
I understand that, and much of that kind of can be traced back to, well, it can be traced back a long way. Perhaps at least to Duchamp, but certainly to conceptual art. And in a way, I suppose Serra is a conceptual artist in that he thinks the thing up and then gets it made. But, and I think for me it's an important but, his work speaks about power. It speaks about power. And it seems to me to be tinged with that kind of notion that might makes right. And I'm bothered by it, by that sense of it. for all that I am impressed by it, for all that I'm often overwhelmed by it and moved by it, but at the same time, I come away thinking about it and thinking about that idea that, in the end, what's it really about?
I think it's an awful lot about the person of the artist. I think so much of this work sort of stands in for a persona, rather than a worldview or an insight or an intuition or a history. It's it's a kind of song of himself. And it's declarative and tautological, obscure, opaque, monolithic. There's no interior space. It's kind of a sphinx with not much of a secret. And there's just so much magic involved. I mean, that this piece in that space, if it were placed anywhere but at the crossing of these two main axes, it would be somehow diminished. It would be kind of an actor in space, like the rest of us. But instead, it's sort of this sort of mystical axle of the world that everything should revolve around.
Yes.
And it appears by magic. We know it's enormously heavy. We know that it took tremendous, I mean, apart from its making, it took tremendous equipment and manpower to maneuver it into that space. And yet it appears without a mark, without a scuff, a bruise, a scratch, nothing. So it's this demonstration of immaculate power and an enormous budget. I mean, it's anything but counter-revolutionary. It's a kind of expression of and a kind of homage to powers that be, which deign to provide this spectacle of just a smidgen of their power.
Yes, I absolutely agree, Brent. I think that's my feeling exactly. I mean, it could be a monument, couldn't it? It could be a monument.
Yeah, I think that's a dirty word in the Serra dictionary, but it's like it's nose in your face. You can't ignore, you can't not notice the message of all this effect.
Yeah, but at the same time, especially in a gallery, Serra's work takes on that kind of thing, the power trip, whatever. And his work is out of the gallery, I'm a little more comfortable with it. And looking at this piece, I keep thinking about things he's got in the desert in Qatar, someplace in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And it's the bleakness, that sort of emptiness of this power trip that comes, it's part of the message, part of the content is that when 20 years ago, there was a show, and it was around the time of the invasion of Iraq, and everybody talked about shock and awe, that the Serra show was bringing the same kind of shock and awe to the art world that Bush was bringing to the real world. But the thing is that and Serra has made a point of saying that he didn't vote for Bush or something. He's not about, or he's a complicated guy, is what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
Or the work is more complicated than just being about power.
Oh, of course, it's not just about that, but ultimately, that's one of the things that I'm left with. And the other thing that I'm left with is the sense in which, and particularly in this case, although it's not unique by any means to Serra's work, is the sense in which this thing is invulnerable. It is absolute and invulnerable. I mean, you cannot touch it. You know, you could touch it, but it doesn't give a damn, and you're not going to affect it. It is the spectator who's vulnerable, not the work itself. And you know, this makes it unapproachable. You know, it's.
But I can sit here and say that you know, that thing at the Museum of Modern Art is stupid. You know, I'm not intimidated by it. It's a mistake. And you know, obviously it doesn't matter what I think, but
yeah, I'm sorry, I've got to insist on this. We were talking fairly recently about Alan Surratt's work, and the sense in which that work is vulnerable is so opaque, it's so obvious, it's so clear that the artist is allowing himself to be vulnerable in exposing, you know, his production in this way, and this is the reverse of that. It is utterly and totally without any vulnerability, and you know, it is a kind of denial of the possibility of any kind of intimacy in that regard. And in this context, we should touch on the drawings that are in this show, and which as I said at the beginning, I think I wish they were not there, because I think that diminishes the impact of this single presentation of this cylinder in this space. The drawings somehow, I felt, just took away from, you know, what it was that was very much there in this space. That presence that was there, that, as BRANDT has said, almost magical, mystical presence. The drawings just felt kind of tedious and commercial, and I you know, I did not find myself engaged by them. And anybody else feel that way?
Well, you know, again, as an erect, walking, mortal animal being in a real world, you know, the drawings take a position of independence and superiority to, you know, every risk that I run. And I mean, I think the central theme of Serra's work, you know, at its core is opacity. And it wants to assert itself without giving away anything. And the drawings are remarkably free of, you know, a sense of outline and proportion, of difference. I mean, there's only two things in Serra's world. There's, you know, steel and everything else, and there's black and there's white. Yeah, I mean, it's just some of the stuff. I know that, you know, there's complexity and ambiguities that can be generated by black and white, but in another sense, you know, when the obvious is, you know, banged at one to this extent over so many years, you can't escape noticing that there's a kind of a binary simplicity that parades as something more complex than it is, something more fundamental. I don't really find this work basic in a sense that, you know, I could say that the work of Brancusi or Rodin or Giacometti or, you know, a lot of other work of antithetical form is. I don't find this work inherently philosophical and strict or rigorous either. I find it highly emotional and highly egocentric.
Yeah, I agree. And I think
I mean, I've never learned anything from the profile of the artist himself.
Yeah, the show is out there, and Serra himself is, you know, is a living guy, and it, you know, the cylinder is, it's not an official tower of Serra's, but it makes me think of Willard Boepple's towers, and one of Willard's towers is up at Pamela Salisbury's gallery up in Hudson now. And you know, this show sort of isn't, or the exciting thing about it, or maybe the most exciting thing about it, is that it allows me to think about other things. And, you know, I can look at this heavy, invulnerable cylinder at the Zwirner gallery, and I look at Willard's lighter, vulnerable tower up in Hudson, and it's, I see more things in both things. And, you know, I'm sort of not going to let Serra push me around. You know, I can take something or other from his drawings, not what the catalog might say about Serra's drawings or what Serra might say in an interview or whatever, but they're out there, they're vulnerable and nourishing to some extent.
well, Jock, I'm impressed by your generosity and your ability to find yourself in dialogue with other work and other people in experiencing this show. I mean, it seemed to me that my experience was to the contrary, that this work, this show, seemed to deny that possibility. I mean, implicitly did not engage in a dialogue with anybody except possibly Brancusi. I gotta let it go. I gotta let it go. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh boy.